The grease lamp guttered against limestone walls, slick with 2 centuries of cellar damp. In the archive's sub-basement, beneath a Lisbon merchant house condemned for demolition, a restoration crew found something the inventory never mentioned: a sealed oak chest, its iron clasps fused with rust wedged behind a false wall. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle as dead leaves, lay the private papers of a man history had almost erased. His name was Henrique Veloso de Tavares, a court cartographer dismissed in 1761 for what his contemporaries called delusions of the southern ice. The official record says nothing more. A footnote: a failure. A man who drank too much and saw monsters in empty water. But the chest told a different story. Beneath the brittle parchment of trade routes and coastal surveys, the restorers found something that should not exist: a coastline. Drawn in meticulous ink, annotated in a dead dialect of Portuguese, depicting a continent without ice, rivers cutting through temperate valleys. Settlements marked with the same careful symbology Tavares used for working ports, harbors, granaries, what appears to be a fortified capital near a coordinate that, on any modern map, sits buried beneath 4 kilometers of Antarctic ice. The parchment has been dated to a period predating any recorded expeditions south of the 40th parallel by nearly a century. Mainstream cartographic history insists this is impossible. No ship of that era could have charted an ice-free Antarctic coast, because by every accepted timeline, the ice has reigned unbroken for millennia. And yet, here is a coastline, here are settlements, here is a continent that, according to every textbook ever printed, was never supposed to be seen by human eyes at all. If Tavares saw what his maps suggest he saw, the question is no longer whether he was delusional. The question is what he saw and why someone made certain the world would never look again. To understand why Tavares vanished from the record, one must first understand what 18th century cartography was permitted to claim. By 1761, the boundaries of the known world were not simply geographic, they were institutional. Lisbon's Royal Cartographic Office operated under strict doctrine. A chart was only as credible as the expedition that produced it, and no Portuguese vessel of record had sailed below the 40th parallel south in living memory. The accepted history of Antarctic discovery does not begin until decades later, with Bellingshausen and Bransfield circling a continent assumed, by every measure of period seafaring, to be unreachable, uninhabitable, and entombed in ice since before human memory began. This is the narrative still taught without revision, that the southern ice cap is ancient beyond reckoning, unbroken for tens of thousands of years, and that no civilization, however advanced, ever stood upon its coastline to draw it. Tavares' chest, by this logic, could not contain what it appears to contain: a coastline without ice, a capital where there should only be glacier. The official explanation offered no investigation, only diagnosis. The court physician's report, filed alongside his dismissal, attributes his charts to an excess of melancholic vapors and recommends rest. It is a tidy verdict: a broken man, a fevered hand, an inkwell that wandered where no ship had gone. For 260 years, that verdict held. No further inquiry was made into the source of his coordinates, no expedition was dispatched to verify or disprove them, and the chest itself was never catalogued. The convenience of that silence is, perhaps, the first crack in the story. Examine the coastline itself, and the tidy verdict begins to fracture. The latitude markings on Tavares' chart align, within a fraction of a degree, with subglacial bedrock topography only confirmed by radar surveys conducted in the 20th century. No 18th century instrument could have produced that precision through observation alone. A sextant and a compass do not reveal what lies beneath 4 kilometers of ice. Either the alignment is an extraordinary coincidence, or Tavares was working from a source far older and far more accurate than anything his own century possessed. There is a second anomaly, more unsettling than the first. The dialect annotating the harbors and granaries is not standard Portuguese, nor any documented regional variant. Linguists who examined surviving fragments in the 19th century before the chest disappeared from circulation entirely noted vocabulary and orthographic patterns with no clear lineage, as though the cartographer had transcribed, rather than composed, the labels himself. Then there is the matter of the timeline. If Tavares charted this coastline directly, he would have required a vessel, a crew, and a voyage south of the 40th parallel decades before any such voyage is recorded. No ship's log corroborates it, no customs record, no provisioning manifest, no survivor's account. The official narrative has no mechanism by which this map could exist, and yet it does, sealed in oak, hidden behind a false wall, in a house that was not his own. A man does not hide evidence of a delusion. He hides evidence of a truth he has been told to forget. What Tavares left behind suggests he was not inventing a coastline from fevered imagination. He was copying one. The question that follows is more dangerous than any cartographic error. Copying it from what and from whom? If Tavares did not invent the coastline, the only remaining possibility is that he inherited it, whether through a single surviving document, an oral cartographic tradition, or a fragment of knowledge passed down from a civilization that predates the conventional timeline of human settlement entirely. This is the threshold where official history refuses to step and where the alternative theory begins to take shape. The theory holds that before the last major glaciation locked the southern continent beneath permanent ice, its coastline was temperate, navigable, and inhabited, not by a primitive scattering of hunter-gatherers, but by a maritime culture sophisticated enough to survey its own coastline with an accuracy modern satellites would later confirm. Some researchers outside the academic mainstream call this culture by different names: a pre-flood kingdom, a forgotten thalassocracy, an civilization whose existence was erased not by myth but by ice. What unites these competing names is a shared claim that this culture's cartographic knowledge survived its destruction, passed hand to hand, copy to copy, through generations of mariners who no longer understood what they were preserving. Under this theory, Tavares was not an explorer. He was a recipient. Somewhere in his travels through Lisbon's merchant archives, in a port city that had spent 3 centuries absorbing maps, manuscripts, and rumors from every corner of the known trading world, he encountered a source document old enough and accurate enough to depict a coastline no living sailor had seen. He copied it faithfully, annotated it in the only dialect available to him, and in doing so became custodian of a memory the rest of the world had agreed to forget. It is a theory the official record was never built to accommodate, and the evidence that supports it, when examined closely, becomes considerably harder to dismiss. The chest contained more than a single chart. Beneath the coastline drawing, restorers found 3 additional sheets, each more difficult to dismiss than the last. The first is a tidal table, calculating depths and currents along the charted coast with a level of granularity that serves no decorative purpose. Decorative maps of imagined lands do not include working tide charts. Tide charts exist for sailors who intend to land somewhere, or who once did. The second sheet depicts what appears to be an inland network, rivers branching from coastal inlets toward a cluster of marks Tavares labeled with the same symbol he used elsewhere for fortified capital. The placement of this cluster corresponds with disquieting closeness to a region beneath the Antarctic ice sheet where modern subglacial radar has detected an anomalous depression in bedrock, not the smooth scouring typical of glacial movement, but an irregular cavity consistent with collapsed or buried structures. Mainstream glaciology attributes the depression to volcanic subsidence. No excavation has ever been authorized to determine which explanation is correct. The third sheet is the most contested. It bears no coastline at all, only a column of measurements beside a faded sketch resembling a structure with stepped, terraced sides, annotated in the same unidentified dialect. Researchers who have compared this sketch to other contested anomalous maps, the Piri-Reis map of 1513, the Orontius-Phineas chart of 1531, both of which depict portions of an Antarctic coastline centuries before its official discovery, note a troubling consistency. Different cartographers, different centuries, different source materials, yet a recurring suggestion of the same ice-free landmass, the same impossible knowledge of a coast no documented voyage had reached. Mainstream cartographic historians attribute such resemblances to coincidence, cartographic error, or the misidentification of South American coastlines. Each individual explanation is plausible in isolation. Together, repeated across centuries and across cartographers who could not have collaborated, the pattern becomes harder to wave away. What the chest suggests is not an isolated delusion. It suggests a tradition, a thread of inherited knowledge, surfacing again and again in the hands of men the official record was quick to discredit and just as quick to forget. A discredited man's papers do not typically survive 2 centuries sealed behind a false wall. Someone placed them there. Someone wanted them found later, or perhaps wanted them never found at all, and the wall was simply the safest available compromise. The trail of Tavares's papers after his dismissal is fragmentary, but not silent. Court records show his charts were initially confiscated by the Royal Cartographic Office, the standard procedure for any document deemed unreliable. From there, the paper trail thins. A single ledger entry from 1,763 references to Tavares materials, Southern charts transferred to a private collector whose family later sold property to the same Lisbon merchant house where the chest was discovered. Somewhere between confiscation and that transfer, the papers left official channels entirely. This matters because institutions that formally catalog and then quietly disperse contested material are not behaving like institutions convinced the material is worthless. A genuinely delusional man's charts would have been destroyed or left to rot in an archive, footnoted and forgotten. Instead, they were moved, privatized, and hidden. The motive does not require a single grand conspiracy. It requires only the ordinary self-interest of institutions whose authority rests on a stable narrative. A Royal Cartographic Office that admits a dismissed employee may have accessed knowledge predating its own expeditions undermines its own claim to primacy. A church that has spent centuries anchoring human history to a fixed and recent timeline has no incentive to entertain a continent's worth of contradictory evidence. Later, the same caution would shape how museums and academic institutions handled other contested artifacts. Not through dramatic destruction, but through quiet reclassification, indefinite storage, and the slow erosion of provenance records. Tavares was not silenced by a single hand. He was silenced by a system built to protect a timeline, and systems do not need malice to bury what threatens them. They need only the will to look away. If even a fraction of what the chest implies is true, the consequences extend far beyond one disgraced cartographer's reputation. They reach into the foundation of how human history is currently dated, taught, and understood. The accepted timeline holds that organized maritime civilization emerges only after the last glacial retreat, roughly 12,000 years ago, and that any culture sophisticated enough to survey a coastline with precision belongs to the last few centuries, not the last several millennia. Tavares's chart, if it descends from a genuine pre-glacial source, demands a different timeline entirely, one in which a seafaring culture existed, mapped its world with remarkable accuracy, and was erased so thoroughly by advancing ice, that almost nothing survived except a single inherited fragment, copied and recopied until it reached the hands of a man with no idea what he was preserving. This would not simply add a footnote to history. It would require renegotiating the relationship between catastrophe and memory, suggesting that entire civilizations can vanish, leaving only echoes, a dialect with no descendants, a tidal table for a coast no longer accessible, a sketch of a terraced structure now buried beneath ice and silence. It would also mean that every other anomalous map, every contested chart historians have dismissed as coincidence or error, deserves a second look, not as isolated curiosities, but as scattered fragments of the same buried memory, surfacing independently across centuries because the source material, however corrupted, was real. The paradigm shift is not that ancient peoples were advanced. It is that an entire chapter of human achievement and human loss may have been quietly omitted from the only history we agreed to remember. The chest has since been transferred to a private conservation lab, its contents photographed, its dialect submitted for analysis that, as of this telling, remains unfinished. No museum has claimed it. No university has issued a statement. It exists, for now, in the same quiet limbo that swallowed it the first time. Acknowledged, unresolved, inconvenient. Henrique Veloso de Tavares died in 1769, 8 years after his dismissal, in a rented room near the Lisbon docks. The parish register lists no cause of death beyond decline. No monument marks his grave. History remembers him, if it remembers him at all, as a footnote about delusion, a cautionary tale for cartographers who wander too far from what their century permits them to see. But perhaps the lesson is the opposite of the one history intended. Perhaps the men dismissed as delusional are sometimes the only ones who looked closely enough to glimpse what the rest of us were trained not to see. A coastline beneath the ice, a capital beneath the silence. A wall built not to protect a house, but to protect a story. Somewhere beneath 4 kilometers of Antarctic ice, ground-penetrating radar continues to map shapes the official record has no name for. Somewhere in an archive not yet opened, another chest may wait behind another false wall, holding another fragment of the same forgotten coastline. The ice does not give up its secrets willingly, but ice, unlike institutions, has no investment in preserving a narrative. It only preserves what is buried beneath it, waiting for someone willing to look past the verdict already written. The question Tavares left behind was never whether he was mad. It was whether the rest of us have simply chosen for 260 years not to ask.